why don't you offer a selection of products, perhaps? This is what I think about. It's what I dream of. So, and if I'm boring, you just let me know. But why don't you make something that machines can't make? Why don't you make something that machines can't make? And then, as a result, you might be able to have a market that's not able to be attacked in some ways as a machine. Folks like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel have some pretty interesting theories about what's going to happen in the future, and people talk about universal income and that sort of thing. And I say, well, wouldn't it be so boring if people just got a paycheck and they did nothing? They're required to do nothing. People need a sense of like doing something good. They need a sense of having a challenge and feeling of belonging to actually feel satisfied. So why don't we create industries that support that instead of telling people that we can send you a paycheck at the end of the year, and actually robots are going to do everything in our factory.
What if your work could be an adventure? I'm David Cadvey, and this is Love Your Work. I'm here to help you find the clues that will lead you to your calling. Not too long after moving to Colombia, Danny Michlewicz got obsessed with cacao, the raw material that's used to make chocolate. Since then, he's been learning about the craft of sourcing cacao and making chocolate, learning about his new country in the process, and working to have an impact on an underserved region. I went into this interview thinking that I would talk with Danny more about how his business, Tilín Cacao, has been a source of adventure, but we actually ended up talking a lot about the chemistry of chocolate and how it's made, and there's also a lot of interesting thoughts in here about finding a neglected opportunity, pursuing it with a sense of artistry, and making something unique and hard to replicate. And Seth Godin's interview is getting even closer. It comes out June 8th, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. If you'd like to hear the raw, unedited, ad-free interview with Seth, you can do that right now. Just join Love Your Work Premium. For a small amount per month, you'll get access to ad-free interviews weeks in advance. You also get access to fully produced episodes a couple of days in advance. Just go to cadvey.net/premium to sign up. That's cadvey.net/premium. And a note before the interview, if you want to try Danny's chocolate, he has a shipment going to the United States later this summer. You can pre-order and get a huge discount on the chocolate. I actually love this stuff. Just go to tilincacao.com/loveyourwork. That's Tilín, TILINCACAO.com/loveyourwork. I don't have any financial relationship with Danny's company, but I do love the chocolate. Here's Danny Michlewicz. Okay, so I'd say that in this room, this machine is probably the most interesting thing that I'm looking at. What is this? It's like it's like a stainless steel drum that's just turning and turning, and then there's these other wheels that are turning in opposite directions that are just covered in chocolate, or what looks like chocolate to me.
Yeah, and this is where a lot of the magic happens, and it's actually very old technology. It's called a melanger, and what a melanger does is it basically grinds down cacao, and it actually can grind down other things, but we obviously use it just for cacao. And it grinds cacao down in terms of particle size, as well as exposes cacao, or what becomes chocolate, to hotter air. And that's also important for actually developing chocolate flavor. And we try to have as much control over it as possible through our different recipes.
So this is, if I'm understanding right, Cacao Nibs, right? They come from the cacao pods, is that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Am I getting this right?
That's good, yeah. So
I did look at the Wikipedia page before I came here, so.
I appreciate that.
For chocolate.
Cacao is a complicated world because it's so large and it spans languages. So you can have a mazorca in Spanish, and that's very clearly, it almost clearly refers to a cacao pod or cacao fruit. when you start to call it a fruit, people start to get confused a little bit. So a cacao pod is good. And then what happens afterwards...
so wait, is the cacao pod then like the kind of big oblong thing?
It's like a football.
It looks like a football, and then it has...
It's shaped like a football with with ridges on its surface, and it can comes in different sizes based on the family of cacao, and then also based on where it's grown.
And then on the inside of that football, it looks like one of those Nerf footballs that have the spiral on it and stuff. And inside of that is that...
Well, the interesting thing is it weighs a lot. It's this, you have this tree that when it's cultivated and manicured, it's about 3 meters high, and off of its branches are these huge pods. They're a lot of times they're sizable, and they weigh like over a kilogram each, because there's this husk that protects these beans, the cacao beans, and the cacao beans are covered in a sugar. You call it a mucílago. It's a sugary mass that lends itself to fermentation, and that's kind of where many people think the journey of chocolate flavor development begins, is fermentation of cacao.
Okay, so it's got sort of like carbohydrates on the outside that can then be fermented by like yeast, or is there lactic acid bacteria? What kind of microorganisms are on there fermenting it?
When cacao begins to ferment, it's a mixture of fructose and glucose, this mass, that then becomes alcohol and carbon dioxide. And that happens through yeast. It happens through the same microorganisms that will ferment a normal fruit. And then that happens at a really low pH. And lactic acid...
It's very acidic.
Very acidic. Okay. It's very acidic. I think about it in amazement, because I always wonder how cacao, which is about 50% fat, manages to survive in some of the hottest regions of the world. Cacao is 50% fat and survives in the hottest regions of the world. And what do you get when you normally have fat in hot temperatures? Fat becomes rancid very quickly. And so it's remarkably stable. And that is because of the fact that there are low pHs, and there are layers of protection that protect this cacao bean, that let it survive and continue to propagate.
Yeah, but fats, they tend to get rancid if they're not saturated fats, right? Like saturated fats don't get rancid as much. Is it mostly a saturated fat then? It's
a very stable but saturated fat cacao.
Okay. Yeah. Have you ever read On Food and Cooking by Harold Mcgee?
We have a copy.
You do?
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, okay.
For sure. I was most fascinated with a lot of the dairy and the cheese, some of these processes that you've seen. I read it years ago, that you've seen your entire life, you just didn't understand. How does one make cheese? Mm-hmm. So I love that book.
Yeah, I'm not even that much into chemistry, but that book to me was just so fascinating. I especially loved the eggs section. Eggs are fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Eggs. Cream is fascinating too. If you eat dairy, cream is fascinating because of how it's able to increase its mass. It's able to increase its volume through agitation.
Because air or the molecules maybe change shape, and that actually makes it.
Yeah, a lot of it relates to just how fats can be structured and can kind of grow in structure, which actually has a lot to do with. So cacao, chocolate, has a chemical structure. A molecular structure, where fats have to be ordered in a certain way. The cacao butter, in a process called tempering, has to set in a certain way, where we actually are trying to create, we manipulate the crystallization of these fats through temperature.
And so the temperature range dictates the way that the cacao butter is crystallized, thus influencing the consistency of the final product, as well as how, does it melt at the wrong temperature and stuff like that? Is that kind of...
Yeah, right on. The way, I think tempering, if we were to describe it, is one of the hardest things to describe accurately for someone who doesn't know a lot about chocolate. And I was largely self-taught. And so it drove me kind of crazy, because you have a lot of videos online of chefs showing you how to temper, but they're not exactly mathematical in their approach, and they assume you know certain things. But what tempering is basically a creation of a stable crystal. It's a creation of a stable cacao butter crystal that lets you have a shine to chocolate and a snap to chocolate and an even melt. Whereas a lot of the times, let's say everyone has probably seen during the summertime, perhaps, a chocolate bar that looks moldy and kind of white.
It has the white on the outside, right? And that's if you can take off the white, that means that it's the fat that's
exactly.
And explain that, I guess.
No, there are two types of. They call it bloom.
Bloom. That's right.
They call it bloom. And bloom, there's fat bloom and there's sugar bloom. And sugar bloom happens when you have higher humidity. It happens when you have high humidity. And basically, chocolate has a certain percentage of sugar. And so when you have high humidity, the water molecule, the water in the air, the water molecules in the air, what they're going to do is they're going to interact with the chocolate if the chocolate is exposed to that air. And the sugar from the chocolate is going to interact. And it's going to kind of melt. It's going to kind of like melt on the chocolate bar, and then it's going to become dehydrated again. So it's going to like melt. It's going to have contact with the water molecules, and then that's going to leave it to have. It's going to leave it to basically dissolve, and then to dehydrate again. And so you're going to have little points that are these little sugar molecules that have sort of had water in them that have dehydrated. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that is sugar bloom, and then fat bloom often results from instability of the fat, which means it was not properly tempered according to different temperature ranges. So basically, when you temper, you have to actually heat. So there's a temperature curve that you have to follow to basically you heat chocolate up so to dissolve all crystalline form, and then you drop it down. And then there's a process of agitation, and what you're doing is you're forming stable crystals in a certain temperature range, which is 33.8 degrees Celsius up to about 37.8.
That's how you get evenly tempered crystals.
Yes, exactly. But it's much more complicated. It's more complicated than that. I think we do everything by hand at our company, which means you can have a tempering machine, or you can have people who know how to temper. And they use marble slabs, the oldest technology in the world, almost.
I see some marble slabs here.
Yeah, so we use marble to actually temper, because what marble does is it is remarkably stable in terms of how, I'm not gonna get this exactly right, but it resists temperature a lot. So if you were to heat the aluminum that's underneath the marble,
we're looking at an aluminum table with a marble slab, a stainless steel table with a marble slab on top of it. Now that stainless steel, the thermodynamics of it are such that if we were to heat a section of it, it would get hot, and then
it transfers temperature remarkably well, whereas marble doesn't. So what you can do with chocolate is when you have a lot of varying temperatures in chocolate, you can actually get the chocolate to go down to a lower level by manipulating it on a marble slab, because that marble will be cold and it won't be affected by the hot chocolate.
It stabilizes the temperature. Yeah. It makes me think of Cold Stone Creamery, which I don't really know that much about except for the name of Cold Stone Creamery, and it makes you think about.
I just remember it's super cool. Maybe
it helps them keep the crystals right.
I think it's
the consistency in the ice cream. Or at least before they became a gigantic corporation.
I heard about Cold Stone about the time they were blowing up. So I think it was one of those things where I had it once and then never had it again, because I wasn't an early adopter of Cold Stone.
Right.
Yeah.
So the cacao nibs gets broken down. So the beans are fermented. And actually, it's funny when you were talking about there's the sort of carbohydrates on the outside that can be fermented and they get broken down into, I guess, alcohol maybe is a byproduct from the microorganisms that are breaking it down.
Well, think about it in the same process of wine or of beer. There's going to be a substrate? There's going to be basically in this case, there's this cacao juice, or there's the malt in beer, or there's this grape juice and grape must in wine. and that supplies the sugars that the microorganisms need. And so there are microorganisms around as always, and these microorganisms are basically going to take that sugary mass and they're going to convert it to alcohol and carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide will not be present, but the alcohol, what it actually does is it penetrates the bean. And that's where a lot of chemical reactions occur.
The alcohol penetrates the bean, okay.
Yeah, for sure. So it will penetrate the bean, and then as well as acetic acid, which actually is also a byproduct in the winemaking process, although not an agreeable one. You don't want to have vinegar. You don't want to have vinegary wine. That's wine that's turned bad, and that's because vinegar happens through an aerobic process, whereas in cacao fermentation, the alcohol is anaerobic. Okay, so actually, when you're out in a farm in Colombia and you're at a cacao farm and you're visiting the center where there's fermentation, you're going to see usually the way it works in Colombia is that there are large masses of cacao that are put in boxes and then covered with plantain leaves, and then they're left to sit for 2 days where they're just left to sit. And during that time, that mass is heated up through the reaction of fermentation. And the sweeter the mass, the higher the heat will be. And that heat is necessary to kill the cacao bean. If you do not actually kill the cacao bean, what's going to happen is that there are going to be a lot of bitter tastes that actually continue so there's going to be latent bitterness. So if you let the bean sprout, that's going to happen. So there's this process that actually leads to chemical reactions happening within the bean, and then this alcohol penetrates the bean, and that's where a lot of flavor starts to develop. And then that kind of leads the way for drying and roasting, and it's where what scientists or many experts in the industry say is that's where the precursors of chocolate happen. That's where chocolate flavor starts to develop. Because if I were to give you a cacao bean straight from that pod we were talking about before, with this kind of sweet substance around it, the sweetness of that substance would taste great, and then you would bite into the bean, and you would think that you're eating like a green almond or like a lima bean or something like that. It's a very green flavor. It's almost like a green vegetable.
Like an unripe.
Yeah.
An unripe flavor, like eating an unripe banana or something like that.
Exactly. Actually, that's one of an unripe banana or unripe plantain it's a sign that the flavor when we evaluate cacao is green. We call it greenness, and to basically calibrate palates and make sure everyone kind of knows what we're talking about, we actually think of and we'll try green plantains.
Oh, okay.
Because it leaves a stainy residue in your mouth. It can dry the mouth out, but there's a distinct greenness about it, and it comes from this lack of maturity.
Yeah. You've seen Somm, right? The Netflix documentary about people who are training to become master sommeliers, and they're always just...
I've seen the beginning of an episode. I really like...
Green plantain or green banana sounds like one of the words they would have used to describe it. You were saying that you liked the part of it.
Definitely. And I learn a lot from wine, a lot from coffee. Coffee you get a lot in Colombia. So we learn from the coffee industry tremendously because the cacao industry is so young here.
I didn't know that. I guess I sort of associate Colombia with chocolate in some way. I don't know why.
You're right, and I'll tell you why. Colombians have been drinking hot chocolate for generations in certain regions of Colombia. Actually, in Antioquia, which is this greater state.
The state that we're in, yeah.
They drink hot chocolate before they drink coffee. However, what's happened, and you hear about this in the United States very much, is that there was a consolidation of industry in this food industry. Just as there was a huge consolidation of the beer industries in the world, and then quality or certain niches may have gone away.
Kind of like how Miller Coors owns Corona now. And
exactly.
And all that.
Exactly. So there's this consolidation.
That's happening in chocolate too.
Yeah, exactly. And so people are used to drinking hot chocolate. But what it means is that there is a table chocolate, basically a raw cocoa mass that's bought in stores, and it's mixed with water or milk and then sugar. And what seems to happen, I love this tradition, but when you drink hot chocolate a lot of the time, what people value are these creamy notes they value texture a lot. They don't value the subtle chocolate flavor. It's harder to transmit. What you're trying to transmit.
Like the tannins?
Well, you're trying to transmit various flavors that remain in a cacao bean, and what we specialize in is obviously cacao from certain regions that taste a certain way. And because chocolate, or because cacao has so much fat in it, and fat and water don't mix so well, a lot of the times you'll drink cocoa powder. And cocoa powder is a derivative of the industry. What it does is cocoa powder, almost always, not always, props to several companies that do a good job of this, but almost always cacao powder goes through a high heat process and also a process of alkalinization, which kind of rids the flavor of what is maybe chocolate from a terroir. So you're basically having like table wine, and the wine, if we were to compare it to wine, you're drinking table wine.
Who are the companies that do that well?
There is a company called Big Tree Farms in Bali that they do raw cacao powder. And I remember when
Bali, over
Bali,
near Indonesia.
But it's an American guy, an American family that started this. And they were really they were not just transparent, but they were very strict as to saying, hey, listen, they created a machine to be able to create these products because they like to create raw products. A lot of the time, raw is associated with higher nutritional content. And so they created raw chocolate products. And so they actually, they stand by and they are transparent with their products. And I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. So I guess the cacao beans are in these burlap sacks that we're looking at that are stacked up against the wall.
Exactly.
And if those are already fermented, like you were saying, they're already fermented in some center in the forest or something.
Yeah, David. So I'll tell you that we receive cacao that's fermented and dried to a certain humidity level. I'm giving you a lot of geek stuff. So
no, I like the geeky stuff. Hopefully, the people who are listening do too. But
yeah,
if not, too bad.
No, so
just kidding, everybody. I appreciate you listening.
Well, so think about it, okay? So you've got, this journey with cacao is amazing because you have these beans that are covered in this sugary mass in this pod. And then you open up the pod and then you throw this, you basically take a bunch of this cacao and you bring it together in a large mass so that it heats up. And then there are these chemical reactions that happen. And then these chemical reactions create some of the most beautiful flavors on earth that we know as chocolate, that we've known as chocolate for a long period of time. And then what you have to do is you have to give it some stability. When you give anything stability, you take water out of it a lot of the time. So you have to dehydrate, otherwise mold is going to grow. So you basically, you dry until a certain level of humidity. Okay, there's a certain range. And then you basically, that's how cacao is exported throughout the entire world and sent through all sorts of container ships and all sorts of trade routes. And we receive cacao from 2 regions of Colombia right now, from 2 regions, and we receive it in these sacks. But we like to think that our factory really starts in the field. That's what we're going for, because a large part of the beauty of these chocolate flavors starts over there. And then we continue it, in Medellin at our factory, we'll receive this material, we'll evaluate it, and we'll convert it to a finished product of chocolate, right? This amazing chocolate that we'll make. But we're looking for consistency from that raw material to make sure we can always make what we say we're going to make.
In what ways are you able to control that raw material?
Okay. There are some really important ones, okay? The first one is roasting, okay? The first one is roasting, whereby when you roast cacao has an amount of sugar in it naturally. Like it has a sweetness in it naturally. That then when you roast, it leads to a Maillard reaction, okay? So there are chemical reactions that are happening when you roast. That develops a lot of flavor. Maillard reaction you'll find in meats when you're cooking meats. It's a very beautiful and complex reaction, okay? Now, cacao also has cacao is one of the most complex foods on Earth. And I say that truly because cacao has over 500 aromas, they say. Over 500 distinct aromas. And what's fascinating is that in this day in the lab, we're not able to replicate this. We're not able to replicate and synthesize a chocolate taste. So vanilla, natural vanilla that you get from Madagascar or Mexico, or I think Tahiti, you can actually replicate. You can replicate, and it's called vanillin, and it smells and tastes like vanilla. And you can't do that with chocolate. You can't because it's so complex, and because it's actually by law. I think it's like you're not allowed to like manipulate food in certain ways and just combine it to 500 aromas. There are limits there. But even if they could, they couldn't actually replicate it. So you're dealing with something inherently extremely complex. And then what you're dealing with, then the tools that we have are then we apply a certain amount of heat to cacao to roast. Okay, and then it's similar to a roast profile of coffee. Okay, and that's where a lot of our work begins with actually doing very low roasts and evaluating the cacao, evaluating the raw material, and then once the cacao is roasted, this is where we actually start to use the melanger. We start to actually incorporate. We start to grind and we start to incorporate air, and we look for certain temperatures as well. So we're looking actually to develop chocolate to a certain temperature. And basically, I don't know if you know this, so this machine will run for between 3 and 4 days at a time to make a single batch of chocolate.
On the Wikipedia page, it was talking about, I don't know if they were using a different word, but they were saying that you might grind the nibs down for as long as 72 hours, and it's a high quality chocolate, which it must be. Yeah. I mean, I know that it is.
So there's melanging or grinding. There's also a period of conching, and it depends.
Conching, that's what it was.
So is
that those machines over there?
No. So these are all we have. Every artisanal company has sort of their own setup in the chocolate world. There's a lot of lack of standardization because 15 years ago, nobody could start a chocolate company because machines were so expensive. So there was sort of like a revolution in chocolate machinery because there were some really smart geeks in the United States that started to say, hey, listen, we can actually take machinery that was used for, say, making hummus, and we could start to use it for chocolate. Have the same design as these old chocolate machines, why not? Because actually, if you're looking at starting up a small chocolate company with machines that existed 15, 20 years ago, that small chocolate company, the startup cost would be $500,000.
Yeah, and when you say small, what's this machine called again?
The melanger?
This melanger, I mean, it looks like it's maybe 5 gallons or something like that.
Yeah, so we'll make about 10 kilograms of chocolate here.
Okay, and then over there, these other machines.
So we have smaller machines. They actually provide us with a little bit more control. They're the same design. It's the same design, but we have more control in terms of heat here. And then we also have, and then they actually are able to get a slightly finer product than we have with larger machines.
And these look like barely more than a gallon.
Yeah, these are tabletop machines. These are tabletop machines.
Yeah, they're just sitting on a stainless steel cart.
Exactly.
We're in a room that's, I don't know, 15 feet by 15 feet, something like that.
Exactly.
And so then you get it broken down in these really, really fine particles with the conching.
What conching does is conching helps to actually, there's latent water in a lot of cacao because you get cacao and there's still going to be a little bit of water. It helps to aerate. It helps to basically remove any latent water. And then also it helps in developing texture and then also getting rid of any acidity. Getting rid of a lot of the acidity, getting rid of a lot of particles that might be a little bit more acidic, a lot of these flavors, these aromas that I'm talking about.
And then what are these machines? We have a machine that has like a grate over a funnel that goes down to another grate. Yeah. What does this machine do? Well,
so what we're looking at is a machine that actually separates a cacao shell, separates the shell. So there's in front of that, so there's that mucus, that sugary coating on cacao. And then there's a bean, and the bean has a shell. And so this actually separates the shell from what we call a nib. So have you heard of cacao nibs before?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So cacao nibs, that's the raw material for chocolate. We need to get to that nib level by separating the shell out.
Gotcha. By the way, we keep saying cacao, and I want to ask, did you ever look up the Portlandia skit that I told you about?
I saw the
cacao one.
I saw a clip of it, yes. And many people have talked to me about it. So
really? Everybody says that to you now. Every time you say cacao, it's like they just programmed it into your brain or something.
It's true.
It's funny.
Cacao has a certain cadence to it.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like a person is just being, I don't know. It sounds like a person's just being snobby when they say cacao, but it's actually because cocoa is what I think people are more used to that word, but they're actually two different things. I mean, they're kind of the same thing, but they're two two different forms? How would you make the distinction between cacao and cocoa?
I'm a relaxed guy. I try to not be a snob. So to me, it's all good. As long as some people I have a great friend who calls cacao. He just calls it chocolate. He's like, man, this chocolate's so good. I get confused every time, but he thinks in this different way. He's a very, very cool person like that. Cacao, the easiest way I think about it is in Latin America, it's called cacao.
Yeah.
And oftentimes in the United Kingdom, cocoa was like drinking cocoa. And so, there's a little bit of like, it's a language barrier thing. And then besides that, they're relatively interchangeable. So I say they're almost always interchangeable. And then when you talk about like the plant and you talk about the pod and you talk about beans and you're in a Latin country, you'll say cacao. And then cocoa is like, sometimes the folks in London will say, they'll be sipping their drinking cocoa. They're drinking cocoa.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as you know, Seth Godin's a big chocolate freak. I heard him talking about it a lot on his interview with Tim Ferriss, and I just interviewed him, so we arranged to send him some of your chocolate. Name your company Tilín? Tilín?
So Tilín Cacao, and that's how we've started off. And we have a brand called Tilín Chocolate.
Okay, so we've sent some
great chocolate to Seth.
Yeah. And you were talking about kind of the different notes and different flavors and different ways that... Actually, you were talking about what you wrote in the note to Seth.
Yeah.
So what were you talking about in that note?
I think it's one thing that, people love... I love that people love chocolate in the world. I think it's amazing. And I'm so happy to be able to make something that people will like. They'll be crazy about it. But some people take a particular interest in it, and Seth takes a particular interest in chocolate. And he wrote a little bit about dark chocolate and how when you actually try chocolate, and you've tried a lot of it, you get to understand from what part of the world it comes from a lot of the time. And then you get to you have a base or a reference point once you've tried a lot of chocolate. You get to say, hey, listen, this is a little bit more acidic. It might be from this country. It's going to be a little bit more stringent. It might be from this country. And I really appreciated that. He also said, and then you get to understand also what the chocolate maker is actually doing, what he's trying to do, which is very beautiful. I think it's really beautiful to look at it that way because it's sort of an art form and it's very subtle. Not everyone's going to get that, but it's subtle. And one thing about Colombia that's amazing right now and that I'm so psyched about is that Colombia has the largest diversity of cacao in the world. But as a country, it has the largest diversity of cacao. I'm going to visit a farm on Saturday where there are 72 varieties of cacao planted on one farm. And it's a cultural, it's a combination of culture, and it's also a combination of the diverse landscapes of Colombia and how things will pass from one village to another, but not maybe over one mountainside, right? Make sense? Mm-hmm. And so I sent Seth 2 samples of a 90% dark chocolate that we make. 90% dark chocolate is extremely pure.
The Darien?
It's a Darien.
Okay.
Yeah? So
I like that.
It's a cocoa from the Darien Gap. And I love that cocoa.
So the Darien Gap is a geographic feature in Colombia.
It's an area that is basically an area that has the highest amount of rainfall on Earth almost. I believe, you wouldn't quote me on it, but people have told me about that and I'll repeat it.
Oh, yeah.
And it's right between Panama and Colombia, and it's the only part of this entire, the transcontinental, highway.
So the people who I've met who've like ridden a motorcycle from Oregon to Chile or something, they end up taking a boat so they don't have to go through.
They got to take a boat because there's no road there because it's so wet there. It's so wet, and that's really cool. What this climate, what it provides is a lot of range of flavor because what you're going to get is a lot of activity going on in the soils. Now, I'm no expert in it. I've just seen it, and I think it's an amazing thing. And so with Seth, what we've done is we've sent him 2 of the same 90% chocolate bars that we make, but they're from different harvests. And that's fascinating because that actually happens a lot in wine. Where you get different harvests, you get different flavors. You get higher amount of basically photosynthesis. You get higher amount of rainfall or lower amount of rainfall, and that will change flavor. And so I sent him that because I thought he'd appreciate that because he gets to be a little bit more transported into what we're doing. He gets to see, hey, listen, this is a lot. These chocolate makers they will get this bean and it changes. And so then they have to respond to it and they have to craft. So it's a continuous process. It's a creation and a destruction a lot of the time.
Is that something that can be integrated into the name of it? Like the same way that a wine has a year, is there a way to... I imagine it's not every year that there's a different harvest. It's probably much more frequent than that. Mm-hmm. Is there any way that can be... It sounds like it would be like a kind of a cool marketing thing, actually, to have the name of the different harvests on your chocolate.
Absolutely. Well, chocolate right now and the chocolate that we make is all about education. It's all about people, one, being happy, eating something and they're happy about it, but two, maybe learning something. So that's super important for us. So yes, in the future, I think we're a young company, so we want to make sure that we continue to we can get known for this. If we're going to come out with a harvest every year, hey, listen, I've always done this it's kind of how I am. Let's make sure to tread softly, then when we're ready to educate 100%, people will really know. So they'll really know the difference in why, and we can explain it. Because we're still learning. Everyone in the cacao and chocolate world, there's so much that you don't know. It's incredible. So we're learning, everyone's learning. We want to say that because we want to say, hey, listen, maybe we have a well-known company that does this. Maybe we create something with a lot of love and a lot of effort, but we're still learning, and it's important that you guys know that.
Okay. I want to ask you about it. Let's get away from the machines right now, and hopefully our listeners can have a little less noise too. And this room is way colder than the room that we were just in.
Yeah,
is there like a reason for that?
Yeah, it's all about humidity control, and you just got to be able to store chocolate. And we're not too far from the equator.
There's a lot of chocolate in this room.
Yeah, there's a lot of chocolate.
Whoa. Just boxes.
And that's chocolate.
Just these slabs of chocolate too. Mm-hmm. What's with the slabs of chocolate?
Those are lots of chocolate. So we make different, every 72, 96 hours we'll make a lot of chocolate. A lot, like 10 kilograms, something like that. And we're going to store that for a certain time. So that actually lets flavors settle down. And then we'll convert it into chocolate bars.
So they're kind of aging in a way, is that?
They are aging.
How long are they going to age for?
Well, that's interesting. I think right now, every single chocolate should age for a different period of time. And it's just because, more than anything, there's a lot of acid. There are oftentimes acids in chocolate that bring out these really bright... There's a lot of citric acid that bring out these beautiful notes of orange or of mandarin. And so you want to make sure that actually settles down to provide a full chocolate experience, I would say, where people are happy with a chocolate bar from start to finish. So it could be anywhere from between 2 to 3 months.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like now that you mentioned it, I can kind of smell almost like orange rinds in this room. Sure. Maybe that's my imagination, but I've never been very good at actually identifying the different flavors and stuff like wine or chocolate. But I think that your idea of having the plantain or whatever right there to help you.
You know what you got to do? You just have to do a course.
Oh,
you have
really?
to do a course.
So you've taken some courses on tasting.
It's about focused attention. And what happens with chocolate is you want to eat it all. You go quickly. And when I eat chocolate, I trained myself to eat chocolate it takes 2 minutes for me to eat a small piece of chocolate that's maybe 4 or 5 grams. Because you're waiting for the flavors to come out, and because you have to kind of heat up the chocolate bar. You have to heat up the chocolate bar, and so that's why it's melting. And if you're just crunching on chocolate, if you just eat it, you're actually not going to get a lot of flavors. You're going to, it's going to be over in 10 seconds. Right? You're not going to enjoy it.
I love it. This is it just instantly makes me think of life in a way, right?
Sure.
Just that it just reminds me of I've been talking a lot about digital distraction and stuff in my podcast, and the experience of being overstimulated, which is a very easy thing to have happen to you especially in the United States, but in all things in life, when actually you can really just take things slow and enjoy all the little details and notes of things, and there's a lot of depth available there.
A lot of chocolate makers find chocolate making extremely peaceful. They sacrifice a lot because chocolate making is not easy, but they find it peaceful. And I know that chocolate is very magical, and don't take it from me, just a chocolate maker. It's got these layers of depth to it that if you're just around it a lot, you'll understand at some moment in time something will click and you'll say, wow, this is really profound. And I like there's a quote that I won't get exactly right, but it's by Roald Dahl, and he of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and he says, you have to be able to open your eyes to magic to be able to see it. And I think that's just so on point. And I think with chocolate, it's so on point because of that depth, because you're taking your time. And you just have to just be still. And it's pretty cool.
You were talking earlier about how you're a young company. I know I met you like 4 years ago.
4 years ago, yeah.
And you were probably just starting this then.
It was a concept at this point.
It was a concept. Yeah. So, yeah, and I guess you might have mentioned it or something, but what stage were you at then versus what stage you're at now, and what stage you hope to be?
4 years ago, I know that I was really investigating cacao and chocolate then. Learning about cacao and chocolate, you have to give it time. It's important to give it time to not stress out.
So you were just kind of starting learning then?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. And then that took about a year. And once we started to make contact with some good cacao cooperatives, my first visit out to the Darien was with a United Nations entourage, a United Nations convoy almost. It was like I landed at an airport right off the coast of Colombia near Panama, and a United Nations truck picked me up because they were actually supporting these very at-risk communities in extremely dangerous areas of Colombia. And so they were looking for commercial partners. Little did they know I was just starting out. So it was an interesting experience for me because I like to manage people's expectations. But I told them, hey, we're doing big things. I was confident of that. And I've been working with them now for 3 years. And that's kind of where we started to take things seriously and started to talk about developing product, developing a company, getting into these complex things when you develop a company, branding, looking at product, investigating, et cetera. And then always thinking about the fact that we're going to put a lot of attention to the final product. That's super, super important, is to just understand. I know you're really into design. And I know, one thing about design that I always found fascinating is that everyone wants to create an amazing product. They want to, but things get lost along the way. And there are reasons for that. There's distraction, there's deadlines, there are different incentives, a lot of people working on different things. And chocolate and cacao is so incredibly complicated that it's super, super easy to have that same thing happen, to be off point, to be pushed in a certain direction where, in the tech world, if it might be in an app, just making the user interface a little bit too complicated. With chocolate, it's the same thing. You want to be able to distill things down, also get to the heart of things. And so we took our time with that for sure.
How did you end up setting up that visit in the Darien region and then end up getting picked up by the United Nations? There's got to be something there you're leaving out.
No, I went to a chocolate conference, and back then in Colombia.
A chocolate conference here in Colombia?
It was actually a cacao conference. It wasn't a chocolate conference.
Oh, it's cacao?
And Colombia 4 years ago is completely different than Colombia now. I think the tourism here and travel grows by 30 or 40 or 70% year over year. And so back then, you think about the number of tourists you'll find in Colombia now, it was nothing compared. Back then it was nothing.
Back then I would get in a cab and the cab driver would be like, they would want to know where you're from and everything, and now they're like, there's como una invasión de gringos.
Exactly.
Hay demasiado.
They say, exactly, Gringolandia.
Just too many.
I've heard thrown around.
So anyway, it's very different than it was 4 years ago.
Yeah, and I was also I went to actually the center of cacao growing in Colombia in a city called Bucaramanga, where the state called Santander, that's where they produce most of Colombia's cacao, and I just happened to strike up a conversation. And it was interesting to me just because the region was different. And I've always tried to stay away from the center of action. As an individual, my MO is I like to stay on the outside looking in on things and play around in these interesting corners of life. And so instead of we've never bought cacao from that area, Santander. We went to these areas where cacao was super new, and we found people who really needed help. And they were also they were willing to take me seriously and be patient with me and work with me. And in Colombia, the culture is different. In Colombia, the culture of actual being able to be accountable, being able to have good relationships via phone, that stuff doesn't happen. It's very hard. So it was sort of a blessing that we started to work in this region because they sort of needed us and wanted us. And it was wonderful.
This actually just made me think about a conversation that we almost had a while ago about neglected opportunities, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You're into that.
Big time. Well, because I think that's where interesting things happen. So, I mean, the reason why I'm interested in cacao and chocolate in general is because it represents working in this industry is very, very hard. On the one hand, it's very, very, very hard because of I don't know how I could explain it to your listeners, but the sort of the distribution system, the complexity of layers in cacao, it's much more complex than coffee. So sourcing coffee is now a little bit more common, and people will try great coffees from 4 or 5 different cafes in the United States. But sourcing cacao is a lot tougher and it's a lot more complex, and there's a lot more to do because no one's ever done it. When you actually look at and you read these books, you actually see that people just take for granted like a few technologies that were invented by folks all in like the span of like 1850 to 1870. And then like you see a lot of things were lost. You see that there was amazing chocolate and confectionery industries in the United States, in Chicago, of all places. I mean, Chicago was the center of chocolate and confection in the United States in the 1900s, and it was just lost. And now you also look at what's happened now in the artisanal food movement and just people waking up in general to natural food and also food niches. And you see, wow, well, this is just, it's not easy, but in many ways it's wide open. And that's really cool.
We're going to take a quick break. You've heard in this interview that we sent some of Danny's chocolate to Seth Godin. Seth happens to be a big fan of artisanal chocolate. Seth did get the chocolate, loved it, and loved Danny's story about what he's doing to help out the people in the Darien region of Colombia. And Seth Godin's episode will be released in a couple of weeks here on June 8th, but you can listen to it right now, raw, unedited, and ad-free. Just join Love Your Work Premium. Here's how it works. For a small investment every month, you get access to raw interview files, sometimes weeks before they're released. You also get access to full produced episodes a couple of days before anyone else. It all comes in a slick, easy-to-use interface that you can access on whatever device you choose. Just go to cadavy.net/premium to sign up. That's cadavy.net/premium.
Funny, I remember watching some sort of History Channel show where I remember learning about different sort of candy entrepreneurs, like they maybe started the Baby Ruth bar or whatever, and I just remember thinking, wow, this person basically just made some stuff in their kitchen and then had a cart on the street and built a gigantic candy empire out of it, which then for how many decades was that just an industry that had tremendous barriers to entry, right? And so now some things have changed that have perhaps brought the barrier to entry down and made it possible to make a small batch artisanal chocolate company. Is that kind of what's going on?
I bet you that depending on who you ask, you're going to get different answers.
Yeah.
I think the big thing to understand is that when you go to Rite Aid or Duane Reade, you're going to be buying candy bars, not just chocolate, from only 4 different companies. All the Starburst, all the M&Ms, all the Baby Ruths, they're owned by 4 companies. And then there are all these new folks coming in. And the new folks are coming in, they're trying to set up shop in terms of a niche more than anything, in terms of new tastes, which often revolve around a higher price, but pure ingredients in a different proposition. And so then they have to be way better and attractive to a certain public to survive. And so magic is made. Who knows who's going to be there in 100 years? These things change all the time.
It makes me think, I don't know very much about this, but I was reading about the Mast brothers.
Yeah.
How they, supposedly there's this perception that they kind of, I mean, I don't want to make you talk bad about people who are in your industry or something, but from what I heard, there's like, there's this perception that they kind of put on this affront of, we're artisanal and we're this hipster chocolate company, and they were actually using bars that they were melting down, or
yeah, I think
they did that like a couple times. But do you know anything about that?
Sure. I think that the first thing is that when you ever talk to anybody who has a chocolate company, the chocolate companies usually going to be small. There are a lot of amazing chocolate makers in the United States right now. So you have to give them recognition, a lot of credit. And then you also have to understand that they're incredibly emotional. They're incredibly emotional because they've probably put their life savings into making a chocolate company. And then for them to hear that other folks are saying that they're going through this long and laborious process that leads to a lot of sleepless nights and stress, and then instead they're buying fine chocolate from France, melting it down, and then putting a really beautiful wrapper on it and saying that it's made in Brooklyn, right? So you can understand what the reaction might be simply because when people are going to be emotional about that. I don't know what they did. I know that if you read the stuff, there are folks who are respected for their incredible integrity in the industry, and they had some interesting things to say just about kind of connecting the dots. And the thing about cacao is that a lot of the time you can connect the dots because there's only so much really, really good cacao in the world, really developed good cacao. And when I say that, that means a consistent good product that comes from a source that you can then identify, kind of like a vineyard, a certain vineyard, a certain region. There are limited amounts of cacao in these regions. And so when someone starts to have an incredibly developed product from that region, and I believe this may have happened, when you start to say, hey, listen, how did you start making this champagne, right? You don't get grapes from Champagne. Actually, you don't live in Champagne, but you're saying you have Champagne. People start to ask questions because there's a lot of origin there that people are into. So they're probably interested, hey, wow, you guys made a great product. How did you do that? And then once you start going down that rabbit hole, you maybe get to some interesting answers.
Okay. You might start to get to some areas where you hear something you didn't expect.
Yeah, for sure.
So was there a particular moment or moments that you kind of first had this? I mean, to me, it sounds like a crazy idea. Yeah. You're from New York, right? Upstate New York or New York City?
Queens.
Or Queens. You're from Queens.
Yeah.
Now you live in Colombia and you have a chocolate company. Where along the line did you get this idea? Like, I think I'm gonna. Was it after you investigated cacao? Was it before?
Listen,
how did it develop?
For sure. If anyone asks me right now why I'm interested in chocolate or why I'm interested in cacao, it's actually very simple. I'm absolutely obsessed with it. All right. That's now.
But you haven't been forever, right?
No. I didn't eat like 4 chocolate bars a day from age 18 to 25. That wasn't me. But I always loved food, and that's important. And I studied sustainability systems at my college right before I graduated, and I was super impressed by it because I was into the idea of companies being able to do good and have a successful company. So you talk about triple bottom line, you talk about B companies. That fascinated me because I studied economics and because I wanted to believe, and I do believe that that's possible. And then you see chocolate and you see cacao and you see that if you're able to create a product that becomes recognized, you're able to change regions. You're able to change regions in terms of impact. So that means that you're able to incentivize education in regions by paying more and also by working next to cacao associations. So our work is just getting started in this. I look at this now because when you're a larger company, you're able to do this, and you're able to. A lot of the time, people value transparency. Western countries value transparency and fair trade. Europe and the United States value that. And so when you're able to pay more and for quality and then actually help communities help people live prosperous lives, and then also cacao is a very noble crop because it needs shade. So actually there's an agroforestry that goes on in cacao planting. And so that's also quite sustainable. Not always. When you have monocultures, monocrops of cacao do exist. But in many ways, most of the cacao in the world is small family shareholder farms. Small. Talking about, 2 hectares. 2 hectares, and they have about 1,500 cacao trees. They'll produce about 1.5 tons of cacao a year at best. and then they got to sell that cacao, and that's what they live on, and that's that's how they live.
And when we were having the conversation about sending the chocolate to Seth Godin, we were talking about how he's kind of loosely involved with cacao hunters, and I was saying, oh, it's a nonprofit, and you were saying, well, kind of every chocolate company is a nonprofit. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, it depends on the mission, right? But at a small to medium level, most folks who are motivated to start a chocolate company actually care about the origin, and they care about the people that they work with. In our case, associations, otherwise it can just be single farms. And so in many ways, you have to be invested in what goes on in a certain region. You have to concern yourself with stability of regions. That's important in terms of actually just being aware of it. But in many ways, you have to go really deep into into people's lives in a certain way, these farmers, because there needs to be a communication of, a lot of time you're creating a value-add product. So you need to actually educate. It takes time. And you need to educate folks on planning as well, which doesn't always happen because of lack of education, and more than anything because of lack of education in various parts of the world.
Is there a time when you were able to successfully educate somebody on planning?
For sure. And years ago I wouldn't be able to, but it's really interesting because the cacao visits are, I anticipate them greatly. I love them.
So what happened when you decided, I should help this person learn about this, and then what happened? What was that process like?
Well,
is there a story behind it?
Well, no, here's an example, So I think when you work in agriculture in Colombia, a lot of things tend to be simplified down in terms of quality, in terms of just good or bad. But you have to be able to talk about characteristics. And so in terms of education, we do that a lot in terms of education of what kind of, for example, what kind of temperature profile do you want in a fermentation? How do you monitor this, okay? Also, if you're able to send this to me on this date, then I'm able to, as a company, we have certain needs in terms of inventory, that sort of thing. Be able to communicate that, hey, there's a larger price involved if you're able to plan. And saying that that's going to stay there, that's super important, And then, the next level is, our goal is to be able to change an entire region, right? This Darien region in Colombia, right? And that involves being able to set up schools. It involves being able to actually keep communities in rural Colombia, which usually sons and daughters end up going to the cities. This is what is happening in Colombian today, and many people are worried about it, that Colombia is losing its farmers. So be able to tell them, hey, listen, instead of going to a city where chances of prosperity are very questionable, where education is not guaranteed, you can actually become successful by becoming an expert in what you're doing, by becoming world class. So the whole thing is to be able to show that you can become world class in something and have people care about this. In our case, world class in terms of cacao farming. So those would maybe be some examples of how we're trying to get to, on a cacao level, education. And then what we want to do at a larger level when we're a large company.
Can you talk a little bit about fair trade? I know there's this book that I read recently by William McCaskill, Doing Good Better, and he uses a few things in there that are kind of attention grabbing that I think do help sell books. But there was, he was talking about some studies about fair trade certifications and how when they did these studies, they found that a lot of this excess price was not actually getting passed down to the farmers and such. And his argument was basically, you should buy the coffee or chocolate from the absolute poorest country that you possibly can, because that actually helps more. Do you have any thoughts on any of that, or how fair trade works?
Well, I'll tell you this. I was talking today to our food engineer, and we were talking about why we make certain products. For example, we have an opportunity to buy a very stable product in terms of cacao. That means very good quality. When you see all these sacks, a lot of the time you'll get different sacks on different deliveries. It means there will be different flavor, and you have to do this process of this destruction, this creation again of recipes. That is good, and it's good to a certain extent. But if it's happening in the span of a month or two, it can be something that can hurt. And so, but we see that, so in this example, there's one product that's super stable, and there's another product that's much less stable. We talk about, well, it's very clear we take the first product, the more stable one. And I said, no, because actually, we have a different responsibility. Our responsibility is for quality. We have to have quality, and the quality has to be in a very certain range. And we have to make sure that that when we source, we have strong contracts so that we get into a very specific range of quality. But it's still going to be a range, and the wider range might come from more impoverished regions. That's exactly what happens in Colombia, and it's exactly what happens all around the world in cacao. And so what we're doing is we're working with a less quality product early on to develop it. So that's why I say our factory starts out there, because we're actually making that raw material better. We have to make that raw material better. We know that it's not perfect right away, but I prefer to work with these areas. And with respect to fair trade, what we do is direct trade. We do direct trade with incentives, okay? And so that means basically that there are different levels of pay per kilogram of cacao. And so we do a certain evaluation of the cacao, and we pay according to that. And so that's a signed contract. That's a contract before we actually receive the cacao. So that's incentive. So that's different from fair trade, where fair trade you hear a lot about. And we do things differently, but fair trade is important to many companies. It's important to many large companies. And a lot of time what does happen with fair trade is that, it doesn't get passed down. Sometimes it's actually in Colombia, it's actually better a lot of the time. And this has been a story that's been told to me. You get more money on the national market selling it non-fair trade than you get on the fair trade market exporting to New York. And that's simply because of certain transportation costs and taxes that are added on, basically loopholes.
The overhead of the whole fair trade certification industry, or
that's one. There's that, right? Which just means that we know and work with associations that have lost their fair trade certification because it's not worth it, because the cost is prohibitively high.
So the farmers can make more money selling nationally non-fair trade than they can fair trade to say New York.
Yeah, isn't that? That's crazy. That's crazy.
This is a story that you've heard. You're not sure whether.
Once again, I think it's something where I'll repeat it. I hesitate to name names just because I feel like you're all in it together, and you try to be all in it together in chocolate, because there need to be customers. We're a small company. We can't buy all the we can't buy all the cacao in Colombia, and it's not all exported. So there have to be some folks buying it. But I simply mean to say that there are loopholes. There are loopholes that are permissible that I've seen, and that creates a sort of perversion of incentives that way.
Sure, and I think that you were talking about how it's very important to larger companies. I think that the larger a company gets, the more layers of command there are, the more that you start having to write these rules, and then the more that these loopholes show up, because it's not coming from the consciousness of the conscience of the person who's doing the buying. It's because it gets abstracted into this large organization.
It's mandated in a certain way. I mean, one thing that I really actually love to talk about with chocolate is actually the entire chocolate industry was born from very, very humble roots. And people will talk about like the quality of Hershey's chocolate in the United States. They'll say, hey, Hershey's can't eat it, it's sour, etc. But Hershey was actually a huge philanthropist, and Cadbury was a huge philanthropist as well. The Cadbury brothers in the United Kingdom, they gave away so much of their wealth, created towns to basically support poor, impoverished communities in the United Kingdom. They did a lot, and I really like that spirit. I like how it started. Sometimes, however, it gets lost in terms of it tends to get lost when you have large food conglomerates that are public, because when things get public, then buyouts and mergers happen. That's the whole world.
The abstraction of the incentives.
Exactly.
It's not the conscience of the person who's doing the action. There's many, many, many layers of what are our goals that are controlling that monster.
Yeah,
it's just the nature of the beast.
Absolutely. If you take a look, at that machine right there, it's called marmita. It's a heating It's sort of a jacketed heating bowl that basically helps us. We actually don't use it day to day.
Like a giant mixer.
Yeah, and so this actually, it helps control heat so that chocolate can actually stay at a very certain temperature for a long period of time. That was bought from Cadbury. It was bought from Cadbury, Cadbury was bought by Kraft like 10 years ago or something like that, right? This Cadbury was a family company for over like 170 years or something. And Kraft bought it. And then Kraft proceeded to shut down the largest confectionery factory in Colombia. And so I went to an auction and I bought that.
Oh.
And I thought it was, I really value that experience because it taught me so much about this industry.
How did you find out that auction was going on?
You got to be on top of
You just
stuff
heard
like
through
that.
the grapevine in the industry of chocolatiers in Colombia, or?
Well, it's expensive to have a chocolate company. So if you can get anything that's high quality and...
Right, but how did you find out?
Google.
You were just Googling chocolate
auction.
Chocolate auction. There just happened to be that Kraft was shutting down.
Yeah, it happened to be that Kraft was moving its huge factory to Mexico. And, they're shutting down. I don't know if you've had panela. You've had panela before.
That's like kind of a sugar.
It's an uncentrifuged sugar. It's uncentrifuged cane sugar. It's because it's uncentrifuged.
It's very popular in Colombia. It comes in any. That's all. What I don't do sugar at all. So whenever I get like, except for your chocolate, but whenever I get a tea, I always have to tell them sin azúcar, without sugar. But I also have to say sin panela because to them. Panela isn't sugar, but it totally is.
Well, I'll rep panela super fast. Panela is uncentrifuged, and so I compare it like wheat. So white bread and then whole wheat it's very much like that in terms of how I feel when people drink panela a lot here with lime. So there's this custom of drinking this kind of cane juice with lime here. And in the United States, it would be crazy because
it has all
sugar
the other
water.
Nutrients in it.
There are many
basically, the
micronutrients.
Molasses hasn't been taken out of it.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
but it does. I will say that it does actually digest differently. It's got a lower glycemic index, right? But it doesn't. I say this by feel, just because for me, I've had so much experience with just drinking panela, and I don't have any added sugar in my diet outside of chocolate, right? So we make chocolate. We're the only chocolate company in Colombia, to my knowledge, that makes chocolate with panela, and it's much harder.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
It's much harder to make. It's much harder to make just because of various industrial things that I'm happy to actually get into if you want to. Things like humidity and stuff like that, right? Humidity and cacao don't mix well. And panela it's this molassy, right? Molasses is actually like a liquid, right? It's like So and panela is panela exists in Colombia because sugarcane grows here plentifully. And so in the breadbasket of cane sugar in Colombia, that's where this Kraft factory was. And they basically told Colombia, hey, listen, you can't, this company, the Kraft told Colombia, more or less, hey, listen, you guys have the best sugarcane in the world, and it's more profitable for us to actually go to Mexico because we have a larger conglomerate there. And so we're going to take this $200 million factory and we're going to shut it down, even though it's literally next to the most plentiful raw materials in the world. And that to me is absolutely unbelievable. I cannot believe it today.
So what are the economics that create the incentives for that to be better for them? Is the sugar cheaper in Mexico?
Wages and taxes. Comes down to wages and taxes at that large level, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wages are lower in Mexico?
Wages are about 40% lower in Mexico.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, so like minimum wage here, and I don't know if it's by the city or the country, the minimum wage here in Medellin
super low.
Is like maybe $200 a month.
Yep.
Working like 50 hours, 6 days a week.
It's like
50 hours.
I'd say it's about like 290, and then you have to add 50% for kind of social welfare. Yeah.
Okay.
And in Mexico, to my knowledge, probably not Mexico City, and I don't know, but there's a minimum, and that minimum is something like, I think when I calculated it, and when I was traveling through Mexico, it was 40% lower. So I was amazed. And then I suppose it comes down to other things like consolidation and factory efficiency and the development of trade in Mexico, and that is enough. And then taxes are high in Colombia, but that is enough to take a $200 million company, a $200 million factory, I suppose. And I'm just guessing here, but to me, it still boggles my mind that stuff happens. And but you've heard about it in the States, I'm sure. If you ever read any books on like outsourcing and that sort of stuff, it's fascinating. But it's really cool. I think I'll always be grateful for my entire life to see this happening and to understand the effects of it, and to understand that we're a small chocolate company. We're doing the opposite of what everyone else is, or what these trends are. Everyone is becoming much more. They become efficient. Everything is automated. We're doing the exact opposite of that. I remember reading this article in the States a little while ago. Of course, as I followed these elections in November, I remember I did read a cool article about how there's small manufacturing in Baltimore. This was a Times article in Baltimore that went through this narrative of this company and how it had grown. It had grown over the past, say, 15 years, and has incredible employee retention, given Baltimore workers like a really great job. I think they do something like very difficult to do, stainless steel for, actually it might be food industry even, right? But they forge stainless steel, some sort of accessory, right? And they do use a lot of, they do use robotics. But what I loved about this story was it juxtaposed how a worker can, at a factory level, when they enter and they start doing the lowest and the simplest things at a factory level, they work their way up and they gain value. And that value is compensated. It is compensated. And I love that juxtaposition of that to food service industry, where food service industry is so homogenous that you can become a manager, perhaps you can, but there's not this inherent value of doing something that's so hard to do that leads you to be paid more. And so folks can just they go from job to job, and
you don't move up the chain because everything has been, all the tasks have been split out so that the lowest level of skill, somebody can do it, and so the worker doesn't grow. 100%,
exactly. So the worker doesn't grow, and then the worker can just get fired, and they're replaceable. And so they'll be working at McDonald's for 4 years, and they'll make 30 cents more. And don't quote me on that. I don't exactly know. And there are a lot of really amazing companies that are large public companies that are food service companies. But at the same time, I see and I feel that when you work in something that's difficult, it's esoteric, and you are able to become more valuable over time and indispensable, then that also leads to a sense of belonging, and it leads to further education, and it leads to stability, and it leads to worker retention, and then, at a large level, that's able to change a country, and that's really cool because it doesn't really happen today. It doesn't happen. It happened in Asia, I think. It happened in Asia and so I think that reading about that, I'm like, man, that's amazing. Why, if we're going to do, why don't we do that? Because also you have to choose where you spend money. If you have a chocolate company, if you have any sort of manufacturing company, you have to choose where you spend money. You can't. There are some folks who believe that you buy the best machinery and you just work the machinery to death 24/7. Right? That's actually very common. And then there are folks that say, hey, listen, when you're starting up, you need to actually do a lot of testing of market. You have to be flexible. So you have to choose where you spend money. And so a lot of the times when you have any machine, and machines cost so much money, even the simplest machines that do the simplest tasks. So why don't you have things be handmade for a long time? And then the idea is, why don't you offer a selection of products, perhaps? This is what I think about, it's what I dream of. So, and if I'm boring, you just let me know. But why don't you make something that machines can't make? Why don't you make something that machines can't make? And then, as a result, you might be able to have a market that's not able to be attacked in some ways as a machine. Now, at a small company,
very relevant to the coming paranoia people have about automation in general and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, for sure.
So what can a person do that is like very difficult for us to automate.
Yeah, well, my older brother, lives in New York, and we had a great discussion about this topic of automation, because especially folks like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel have some pretty interesting theories about what's going to happen in the future, and people talk about universal income and that sort of thing. And I say, well, wouldn't it be so boring if people just got a paycheck and they did nothing? They were required to do nothing. Wouldn't it be much more amazing? Most of the time, as I said, I became a fanatic and I became obsessed with chocolate after the fact. People need a sense of like doing something good. They need a sense of having a challenge and feeling of belonging to actually feel satisfied. So why don't we create industries that support that instead of telling people that we can send you a paycheck at the end of the year and actually robots are going to do everything in our factory? I understand that I understand that these folks are looking at 10, 20 years in advance. They're looking at time horizons that are different, especially because of the industries they might be in. But at the same time, I think it would just be very boring if that were to ever happen, because so much of innovation is based on culture, and the United States knows that. And why are you going to just basically say that the culture of innovation is going to be stripped down to a few people creating all of the technology and ideas, and then other folks sort of not having an incentive to do anything because they receive a paycheck, because that's how things are? I think that's super boring.
Can we talk briefly about your other company, the one that you were working on more? You still have the ticket company, right? Yeah, so I've had a concert ticket brokerage for 7 years, and that also does a little bit with live events. But I started that when I was actually 3 months out of college. And how does that company work? That company, what it does is that we use. You're smiling like you're embarrassed in a way. Well, I'm actually not embarrassed because I'm very proud of it. But what we do is that we buy because you're proud. No. Well, what we do is we arbitrage concert ticket markets. So we buy and sell concert tickets online. And the thing is that industry has a very bad rap because it's called ticket scalping. Right. And what we do is that we actually rely on a lot of data that we've gathered over the years to basically do things that are profitable and that we do well. And so we've done that for the last 7 years, and we have a 10-person company, and about halfway through is when I started the chocolate company. And so now you hardly work on that company. Most of the time you're working on this one. I would say that company, I work on very, very little. I work on very, very little. Does that company help fund this company? Okay. For sure. It's always nice to have like some company that you can make. I mean, I guess that's kind of the Tim Ferriss fantasy, which was like what I had. Like for the longest time I had this online dating advice blog, which I was so embarrassed to have it that I wrote it under a pseudonym, but I made enough money off of that like when it came time to get a book deal, it came time to do things where I was a little bit more concerned about like what my mission was and stuff, that I at least had some money coming in to help me. For sure. Well, especially if you're able to do something where you're able to make money less of a variable, where it's just not the most important thing you think about, then you think about other things. You think about what you truly care about, right? I mean, that's what this podcast is kind of all about, is where finding the value that you have besides just the money thing, right? The money's important, but there's a certain point where you are able to start making decisions and stuff. Yeah, for many people, it's an interesting narrative because it works differently for different people, and you have to just make sure to understand your relationship with money and your relationship with your life, how you spend your time. How people will always say your time is so limited. Time is it's the scarcest thing that exists, and most people don't feel that. They might not feel that because they might not be in a position to feel that based on if they're working at this kind of job or this kind of job. But when you are able to see that, then you get to maybe choose or exercise a little bit more control. And then it's really, really important because your relationship with that aspect might change. You just talked about this a little bit already, but when was a time that you have left money on the table, and what were you getting in exchange for leaving money on the table? When was there a time when Does that make sense to you? I guess this question is really just all about what values people have other than money. Like, is there a specific instance where you had an opportunity to make more money than you ended up making, but it was because you made a value decision?
I think every day. I think every day, because I think that we, as a chocolate company, we do a lot of experimentation and investigation. And when instead what we could be doing is perhaps we could be pushing more. Every second that I spend on investigation could be spent on, say, sales and marketing. And so that trade-off happens in the chocolate company on a daily basis. In my other company, it happens in the sense that we rely on process and we rely on like core competencies to basically direct the fact that, hey, we're going to be a company that stays this size. We're going to actually not grow because we're conscious of what we're trying to do. And then we become more efficient. So it's a time thing, and it's also, maybe it's a choice there. Maybe it's a choice there where you're able to say, hey, listen, like, I'm not interested. So a lot of time that happens in the sense that, like, I have to say no to a lot of things. I have to say no to phone calls, and I try to have as little noise enter as possible. It's hard as a chocolate company because people love chocolate and you want to take care of them. But you also want to show them that there's a way, simply because what you're trying to do it has to work in a certain way. You can't do everything. You can't have like office hours. You can't open up your door for everyone always who has maybe the same question about chocolate. And that leads to things like, how do you educate? We're thinking big about videos, because videos have become so popular as a medium to communicate some of these subtle things that we're talking about today, so that people can start to connect the dots the way that we have. So we get so that one, we just educate people in general, and two, people know us for being transparent in this way, and that way their questions also will be more education. Their questions will inspire us. They'll be more educated, and where we'll be like, oh, well, of course we're going to take the time to answer this question. So I think in many ways it's how do you make your time more valuable, more enjoyable? How do you develop? I think about this Maslow hierarchy, which I kind of realized until someone kind of told me about it. I didn't know about it until someone told me about it. I was like, well, yeah, I've been looking at that for many years, as many people have, and it's kind of, how do you be able to, once maybe money doesn't matter or matters less, you have all these choices for how you spend your time. And one of the great things, as I was talking about before, with being on the outside looking in, is that you don't feel these pressures, David. You don't feel these pressures of, say, hey, listen, I'm going to take the 2 weeks I have from my vacation this year to go do this conference, this festival, this trip that my other friends have done, because I feel like, one, I have to join them, or two, I feel like that's what everyone does.
You only have the 2 weeks. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think that's what humanity has been climbing up for the longest time, and I think that it's something that we're on the cusp of. My little theory is that we're kind of on the cusp of another leap there. We eventually weren't growing our own food, so we got to think more and write more books and do more philosophy and stuff, and we got into automation and industrial revolution, and now most of it have nothing to do with our food and all that stuff, which is has its goods and bads. But especially when we think about the coming, at least what people think is coming as far as artificial intelligence goes and stuff, people are freaking out, and I'm thinking like, well, this could be a good opportunity to see what the next level is. Yeah,
I think about a quote in one of in a Kurt Vonnegut book that obviously is going to be super satirical or ironic, and I think the quote's like, I think it's like the opener for a book or a chapter, and it says, the human race spent 25,000 years looking on the outside, and then at the 25,000 first year, they started looking on the inside, and that's when everything changed. And that's when they started to discover more stuff. I think I relate.
It's a book about the future.
The Kurt Vonnegut book. I'm guessing that this is from this book called Sirens of Titan.
Okay,
I could be wrong, but I highly recommend it because Kurt Vonnegut had a way of putting things in this really beautiful light.
Wow.
And if I can just try to tie that into what we were talking about before, we were talking about magic and stillness. It's, well, hey, listen, maybe nobody knows, maybe nobody manufactures their food anymore. But we're also assuming that we discovered everything we needed to know about food quality and food enjoyment. Whereas what the food industry is efficiency and cost, and actually understanding what the large bulk of consumers prefer, and then kind of going after that. But that's not necessarily true at all. That's why there's huge space. That's why you have people have different interests. You have people that have different allergies. And so you have this whole world to play in, and that's why people are going back to that, because there's a tremendous amount of magic there.
Neglected opportunities.
Exactly.
This has been a kind of a surprising conversation. I didn't know what to expect, because we haven't ever gotten to sit down and like have this long of a conversation before. But I think there's a lot of brilliance in here about neglected opportunities, making decisions according to your values. I wanted to get into you've used chocolate to learn so much about a region and immerse yourself in this country, become more of a part of it. And we didn't get to explore that a lot. But is there anything that you would say to kind of summarize the wisdom that we've put in this conversation today?
Great. Thanks for asking, first of all. I really appreciate your curiosity and your thoughtfulness more than anything else, because when you just look at something quickly, right? I mean, the whole stillness thing, when you look at something quickly, you might not understand. And then you got to just question and question and question. I think that's, maybe we were able to get to some interesting things today because we were able to kind of dig in, and I think that's always really, really cool. And, hopefully I was able to transmit, the satisfaction that I have with that, because once again, I didn't love chocolate the first time I ate it, just like many people don't love what they do when they started, but it's a process, right? And and enjoying that process, and hopefully you have the time to be patient with it is awesome. And then actually sort of evangelizing about it, I think that's also been helpful. Like, talking to you, actually getting to understand what an impact, I've learned a lot from this discussion, so I just appreciate that. Cool.
And it's going to be kind of a shame that I think that a lot of people listening will want to try your chocolate. Sure. And I think it's going to be difficult for a lot of them to get it for a while still, right? Well,
we're in Miami right now.
Oh.
And so if folks have an interest and if they're on your newsletter, if there's a way for us to we can set up some sort of email filter or something super fast.
Oh.
And absolutely, because we're definitely into getting chocolate into anyone's hands who wants it, who wants that educational experience. You can check us out at tilincacao.com, and we mostly sell through all of Colombia and then through Miami, but we're actually we're growing really fast, and we're working on some really big projects in the States. And so it's literally a matter of a week, a month. And so as long as people are able to get to me, make sure that we'll exceed their expectations.
Great. And maybe we can put that call to action somewhere else in the podcast, or we could just say right now, is there an email address they could email right now and that would help filter?
Yeah, for sure. Well, my name is Danny. So Danny at Tilín Cacao, Tilin.
That's Danny, D-A-N-N-Y.
D-A-N-N-Y at TILINCACAO.com. So that's my email, and you'll hear back from me. Unless I'm in the Darien, and there might still be some service there once in a while at nighttime. Unless I'm there, we'll get back to you super, super soon, and love that, and definitely know the quality of the listener of your podcast, and so just excited for that.
Great, thanks a lot for coming.
Awesome.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Danny Michelwicz of Tilín Cacao. Again, if you're interested in pre-ordering some of Danny's chocolate, check out tilincacao.com/loveyourwork. And if you want to hear another great story about somebody integrating their adventures into their business, check out episode 23 with Jodi Attenberg. She turned what was supposed to be a year of travel into a career as a food and travel writer.
You build a flexible life so that you can do things that bring you joy, but also that are different than you ever expected them to be.
Again, Jodi is on episode 23. Or you may enjoy episode 63 with Peter Bregiel. Peter has turned adventures such as canoeing the entire Mississippi River or traveling the entire Trans-Siberian Railway into his own travel show on YouTube.
The dreams evolve. The dreams evolve as do we. We grow, and then like we have different aspirations. So I think it's awesome just like have any dream. It's like allow it to change. Like, not to be so stubborn. It's like, well, that has to be it. It's like it could take on a form, and as long as like you have that burning inside your heart to go in whatever direction that you did when that dream first came up, then I think you're fine.
Again, Peter is on episode 63. And if you appreciate all the work that goes into making this show, there are a couple of ways you can help support it. One is to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just hit the subscribe button. Another is to rate the show on iTunes. Just go to cadavy.net/iTunes and click on write a review and click on the star rating. You don't even have to write a review. It just takes a couple of seconds. And do you like books? If you do, I'd love to send you my book recommendations. About 90% of them will be nonfiction on subjects spanning from biographies to neuroscience. Just go to cadavy.net/reading, sign up, and you'll get my first set of recommendations right away. You'll be supporting the show if you buy any of those books through the links in the email. This has been Love Your Work, and I'm David Cadavy. The theme music for this show is More Streets, performed by Spiderflower. Love Your Work is a production of Cadavy Inc.